Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Luffy kills Akainu at Marineford, part 3. So before we start, go check out the author of this fanfic Psychotic Tomato. Subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Let's begin this story. The next day Flamp was shouting into Luffy's ear to get the fuck up from his bed. Get up Luffy Nai-san. He snored and mumbled while sleeping 5 more minutes. It's morning. We got to go for breakfast. Pudding already left. At this Luffy jumped out of bed with a grin looking wide awake which surprised her. Food. Luffy ran off while Flamp lagged behind before following, and it seemed her brother was really hungry. At the dining room, the siblings exchanged good mornings and greetings. Some looked ready for the day ahead, while the others looked like they wanted to sleep more. Food. Luffy busted the doors open and shouted, which woke up the ones who felt sleepy while looking at their brother in shock and slight annoyance. Luffy walked up to Pudding, who greeted him while beaming with 3 eyes open. Luffy grinned and greeted her back before sitting next to her, with Flamp sitting next to him after catching up. Luffy looked at his mother while grinning. Will there be meat? The siblings raised an eyebrow or were a bit surprised at that. It was pretty unusual for a sibling to ask for something besides sweets, desserts, and pastry food. Turtle Land doesn't have meat, but we could contact our traders and ask them about. Big Mom said, shrugging. The siblings were wondering how the servants were going to react when she ordered something besides sweets. They probably would have a look of surprise and disbelief. Luffy, although saddened at the fact he wouldn't be having his favorite food, quickly cheered up. Food was food after all. Maybe he could find something to eat which tasted new. Okay. In the meantime, why not tell us about the things you have seen in your adventures? Big Mom suggested it to her son while waiting for the chefs. She wondered what kind of things her son had encountered. The topic of his past would be brought up way later. For now she just wanted to know about what her sons were through when he sailed. Okay. What should I start with? Luffy's arms were crossed while thinking carefully. The siblings just waited patiently in curiosity. They only really left the land because of orders, missions, and ingredients gathering when they seemed to be running low or in need for a tea party or just straight up visiting a random island that was near here on their off days. Their brother, on the other hand, probably had been through several places which piqued their interests, with the most prominent being Montour. He always wanted to leave and explore around the world to see several different kinds of animals and places of interest, but his duties and position in the crew gave him very little time, so he collected the animals near Turtle Land instead. After a few seconds Luffy raised his head and grinned, finally deciding on a certain island. It had some weird but cool animals. He really wished Gaiman came with them though. Alright. Let's start with Syrup Island. There were a bunch of strange animals over there, and it's where I met God Usopp and met Gaiman. Big Mom and Montour were interested in the animals. Gaiman? Snack asked, tilting his head. Yeah. Gaiman. He was a pirate who was trying to find buried treasure over there, but when he climbed onto a cliff, he fell, got stuck in a chest, and couldn't get out of it. He tried to get help from his crew, but they abandoned him. Luffy said while frowning at the fact he was abandoned by his crew. He is now the island's guardian, and is friends with the weird animals. Luffy finished off cheerfully. What are animals like? Montour asked curiously, with Big Mom leaning forward a bit. They wanted to know more about the animals there. Oh, they're weird. There was an elephant with tiger stripes standing on 2 legs. A white snake with rabbit ears. There's also this creature that has giraffe spots and horns. Luffy happily described what he had seen on his crewmate's home island. Montour and Big Mom lit up more when they heard about the living inhabitants on the island. It sounded fascinating. They weren't the only ones. Most of the siblings raised their eyebrows or were leaning forward in interest and amazement at how he described them. They wanted to see them. Early Chiffon asked wide-eyed. She never heard or seen anything like that before throughout her life. Luffy just nodded towards her. Yeah. They were really cool. Luffy said cheerfully. Big Mom looked at Chiffon when she spoke before she widened her eyes and realized something. Oh yeah. Right. I should be informing her. She said while striking her fist in a palm. As she remembered, the siblings though eyed their mother in curiosity. What's wrong? Luffy asked, tilting his head up at his mother, who looked at Luffy and responded. I should inform Lola we found you. To which all the siblings, especially Chiffon, now realize they forgot to inform her about the fact they found their brother. Well, maybe she did know. Luffy's father was announced in the broadcast during Marineford after all, either through that or the newspaper that came out after the utter failure of the public execution. Luffy though tilted his head at his mama, confused, but Lola already found me back at Thriller Bark. Most of them are either face-palmed or snorted in amusement. She doesn't know that you were her missing brother though. Oh okay. Should we contact her now? Panna asked, eyeing her siblings. We should call her around afternoon. She wakes up. Late Chiffon said, to which they all agreed to. She was her twin after all, so she would know her best. When the doors busted open with the chefs carrying plates of food, they proceeded to eat, with Luffy reaching out towards other people's plate and stealing food, much to some of their amusement, while the others weren't. When they finished eating, Big Mom was pondering about something until she shared her thoughts towards her children. I don't think we should announce the return of Luffy just yet. This caused all of them to be surprised while Pear Sparrow stood up and looked at his mother questioningly. Why is that, Mama? he asked. Right now I don't think it's the right time. Luffy, you and your crew are going to sail out after 2 years, right? Big Mom asked, turning her head towards her son, who nodded. Yeah. When you sail out and explore, make sure to come back to Toto Land. That's when we will announce your return. At this the Charlottes looked at each other, silently communicating before they all looked approvingly at this. It may be long, but they liked the idea of his reveal to be later. If information came out a week later that the son of a dragon turned out to be the son of a Big Mom, it could lead to some undesirable results, to say the least, like painting a bigger target on their brother. It would also be pretty interesting to see their baby brother's crew finding out about his mother, and then when they unite and come here. Big Mom after a couple of seconds looked towards Broly. Broly said woman raised her head and looked at their mother when she called her. When will you take Luffy to train with Rayleigh? We figured out a schedule. I would bring him back to Amazon Lily so he could train after breakfast, and then he would come back 2 hours before lunch. Big Mom nodded. You should probably go early, finish breakfast, and then go, Big Mom suggested, to which Broly agreed to. Alright. Finish your breakfast, and go back to your duties, and try to be back around lunchtime. Yes, Mama. After everyone was done eating, Broly gestured for Luffy to come with her towards a mirror that was placed around the dining room to enter the mirror world. The siblings stayed to wave them off, but before they reached the mirror, the Luffy Montdor called for him, which he responded with a chirp while looking back at him. Are there also strange animals and creatures over there at Amazon Lily? Montdor asked curiously towards him, to which he nodded. Yeah. They're really big and weird. To which Montdor looked interested in before becoming a bit down. He wanted to see them and write down about them, but with his duties and responsibilities here. Is that so? Montdor said a bit sadly, which Luffy noticed and grinned at him. Wanna come? He asked out of nowhere. Eh? Montdor exclaimed in surprise before turning into a serious look. I can't. I have to stay on this island. You can go, huh? Montdor exclaimed surprised before turning to look at his mother, who said that. You can go. You have been working pretty hard. You don't have to worry about your tasks. Me and your siblings can handle them. Also try and write a report of what the animals are like at Amazon Lily. At this he widened his eyes before looking at his siblings, who nodded towards him with smiles on their faces, before turning back towards his mother and bowed. Thank you, Mama. Make sure to show me what you have found there. Shishishi. Alright. Lead the way, Branch Knee. Luffy exclaimed, grabbing onto Montdor with a stretched arm and dragging him. My name's Broly. Broly screeched with a visible tick mark, while her siblings looked on in amusement. Alright. Alright. You can let go now. Montdor sputtered out after being dragged for a bit, which Luffy just laughed at and let go of him. When Broly entered the mirror, Luffy was gaping in awe at how she entered a mirror, while Montdor smirked at his brother's reaction in amusement before walking up behind him, patting his back, motioning him to get in, which he eagerly did. Once Montdor stepped in, the siblings were left alone with their mother. He shook and riled up Broly, huh? Compy commented, amused with her sisters, and brothers nodded in agreement with her, agreed. Not only that, he sure is amazed by some of us PROI, and Pear Sparrow said with a grin, looking pointedly at Bastard, Poir, and Pudding, who warmly smiled while the others agreed, and wondered if their brother would also be amazed by their unique features. When he is done with Rayleigh we should spar with him, Cracker said while grinning along with her other sweet commanders. They wanted to see if he had the power to back up the billion bounty on their brother's head. Amand. Katakuri. Said individuals looked at their mother when she said their names. While you were sailing back, have you found out anything about your brother? At this both had a soft look, remembering what he did for Broly before immediately looking grim. He was tortured, Katakuri said while grimacing and clutching onto his fist. His siblings looked horrified before they had a look of anger. Who? Poor simply asked, looking with her eyes narrowed, looking ready to absolutely slaughter the bastard who did. Her little brother, even though it was such a small time, had quite an impact on her with how he complimented her teeth, and seemed in awe when he looked at them. She felt very happy to know someone raised outside thought positively of her teeth, to think someone would dare torture said person who was so nice. She wasn't the only one though. A man had her hand clutching tightly onto her sword. Bastard had visible veins on his head with narrowed eyes, while Pudding looked equally pissed, as poor. Lijam, a man simply said. Tamago. Get the information on that bastard, will you? Big Mom said, eyeing him like a predator. Tamago gulped. Yes, phone. He sputtered out, and ran off before coming back after a couple of minutes. Well? Oven looked at Tamago, arms crossed with a cold look plastered on his face. Lijam is a pirate who is now deceased. TSK. Well, at least his dead, Oven said, looking a bit disappointed. He wanted to boil him alive. Big Mom was feeling pretty murderous before compassing herself. At least he is dead now, and proceeded to move on to another topic. Tamago. When is Jinbei coming? He should be arriving as soon as Luffy-sama comes back, Bone. Then we can discuss negotiations. Swore. What about Caesar? Any progress? None. He's asking for more money for funding though, as he stated the research was complex. This Big Mom frowned, but shrugged it off. The quantification was probably tough to research. She still had thoughts that said to look further into the matter though. Big Mom dismissed her children, and waited for Jinbei's arrival. She wondered what their candy tasted like. At the mirror world, once entering, Luffy was in amazement and awe at the fact he seemingly entered a place which seemed to stretch infinitely with mirrors everywhere. What is this place? He asked in amazement mixed with curiosity, which had Broly giggling at. Their siblings when they were still children would always be stunned when she entered a mirror and stuck a hand out motioning them to come inside, which freaked them out, but upon entering they would be amazed. Montoro ruffled his hair smiling before explaining. This is Broly-ni-sen's devil fruit power, the mirror no mi. It's a Paramecia type devil fruit. She can create and manipulate mirrors to reflect attacks back at her opponents, transform herself and other living things into mirror images of different people, and most importantly, to turn any mirror to a portal towards the mirror world. At this, Luffy looked amazed at what his older sister can do and turned towards her the mirror world. Broly laughed before further explaining woo. The mirror world is my pocket dimension of sources. Long as I can fit inside a mirror I can access this place. Do you notice all those mirrors placed all over the place? At this, Luffy looked around, and yeah, it was on the floor, the ceilings, and the walls. All of these mirrors lead to the outside world on the other side of the mirrors. Which means you can travel pretty much anywhere, as long as there's a mirror. Luffy looked even more amazed. Really? Broly just laughed again before holding on to Luffy's arm and walking towards a mirror. Stopping in front of it, Luffy saw how the mirror was showing people of different races walking around in streets made seemingly out of food. If we were to step out of this mirror we would be outside Mama's castle, and out in the streets. The mirror here is outside of a general store, Broly explained, while Luffy looked amazed and confused. Why is it there? Luffy never really saw mirrors outside of a store unless it was a store that sold mirrors. Montoro had walked towards Luffy's side and explained, depending on where the mirror would be, she could send people there that would be perfect for ambush or sneak attacks. Either that or transportation. Mama ordered mirrors to be placed around her islands, so she could bring reinforcements if there was ever an attack when she got her devil fruit. Montoro explained, he would help navigate and plan out which mirror she would use. Oh okay. Alright, let's get you to Rayleigh, Broly said, walking onwards to the mirror she had placed at Amazon Lily. Lead the way, Branch Knee. Montoro covered his ears with a look of slight amusement upon hearing the branch. My name's Broly Knee. Luffy just laughed while Broly walked while grumbling with Montoro behind them amused. Luffy thought about how since his Branch Knee had a devil fruit power. Now Luffy turned to Montoro. You can call me Montoro or your Mont Nai, he said, shrugging. That was how he was commonly addressed, as by his siblings. Do you also have a devil fruit? Luffy asked to Montoro, who nodded. Yeah. Ie boku no mi. I can manipulate books, and can place people under illusions. Not only that, I can pin people or animals inside a book, and they won't age or get out. Luffy awed at that. Really, do you have a book with animals or people? Montoro nodded with a proud look on his face. It's in the castle's library. I can show it to you when we come back from your training. To which Luffy nodded at. Here we are. Broly stopped at a mirror, and motioned for Luffy and Montoro to step out of. Exiting the mirror, Montoro looked around the place, and noticed how they were surrounded by trees. Ah, you have arrived. Turning towards whoever said that, Montoro tensed upon seeing him. It was Silver's Rayleigh, the first mate of Roger. So I take it Luffy finally met his family? Rayleigh asked, looking towards Broly, who smiled and nodded. Who is this man? Rayleigh asked, looking, as Montoro still tense. This is Mont Nai. His older brother, said the man just greeted Rayleigh, who greeted him back. So I heard there's some bizarre animals here or something. Montoro took out a book out of seemingly nowhere with a pen in hand. Rayleigh shrugged before pointing, behind which Montoro followed before looking at what he was pointing at and widening his eyes. There stood several animals that were like snakes and lions, but they were beyond huge. But what got his attention were two animals that kind of stood out. A giant red elephant and a giant blue gorilla. I have never seen anything like that before, Montoro muttered out before he started writing down his observations and sketching them out in astonishment. Rayleigh now looked at Luffy and handed him a blindfold. Let's get started. Yeah. Hours later. You have dodged a few more times rather than our previous training, Rayleigh exclaimed while looking a bit surprised, his learning faster than he anticipated. Luffy was panting with his hands on his knees with several bumps on his head. Montoro, upon finishing writing and sketching about the animals while walking around the jungle to look for more, was now focused on his little brother's training. He was wincing at every hit he got alongside Broly, who was standing beside him. They didn't like seeing one of their siblings getting hurt, but it was to train up for him. You're improving quite fast, but still got more to go. To which Luffy nodded at. Alright, it's about time you head back. At this, Luffy took off his blindfold and thanked Rayleigh for training him. Rayleigh laughed and motioned him to go back to Toto Land, to which he did, but not before looking back at Rayleigh. Luffy asked if Rayleigh wanted to join, to which he politely refused and said he would be staying here, to which Luffy nodded. They then proceeded to walk back towards the mirror leading back home, where Luffy would be reunited with a certain fishman. At Toto Land, Castle Room, Big Mom was sitting on her chair while drinking a cup of tea, waiting patiently for Jinbei to negotiate things out for Fishman Island. She also asked him to bring him a handful of the candy they produce there. If it tasted good, she would allow them to fly her flag, and demand a factory to be made with fair wages towards the employees working there, and a reasonable monthly supply of fishman candy from the factory. If the monthly tributes weren't met, as long as there was a good reason for it, she would turn a blind eye towards it, and demand them to meet the next monthly tribute. She did not want to act like some tyrannical ruler who demanded the unreasonable for them, and would send her forces to attack them if they refused, like some kid fussing over how they didn't get their favorite toy. It was one of the many things she changed about herself. When the doors opened, there stood the former warlord with a giant bag which he dragged with his hand with a serious look on his face. He was dealing with an emperor after all. There, sitting down on her throne, was Big Mom, a woman who somehow seemingly lost a considerable amount of weight out of the blue, and looked like she was in her 20s or 30s despite her age. She was looking down on Jinbei with a judgmental look with a sinister grin. She was trying to study and read what kind of person he is. "Ah, Jin. So you have come to discuss the deal, yes?" she said, breaking the silence which Jin nodded at. "I take it that you have brought what I asked for, right?" Big Mom asked while eyeing the bag he was holding. "Yes. Here is the fishman candy." He walked forward and dropped the bag of candy in front of her. Jin stepped back when he dropped the giant bag of candy while tensing, and was ready for the worst situation or outcome. Whitebeard's death was effectively the disbandment of the crew, which also meant the islands that had their flags had their protection stripped away, making them open for attacks. Another emperor providing protection had its pros and cons. If they refuse, she may send her forces to attack. If they accept, they have to meet some harsh terms and policies under her rule. Knowing Big Mom, they would have to likely provide candy. If the candy was satisfactory, she would provide protection, but demand a copious amount of fishman candy. If she found it unpleasant, they may lose a chance to have protection, which meant they would be open to attacks. Big Mom leaned forward and grabbed a handful of the candy in the bag and consumed them. Her eyes widened immediately upon tasting it. "Sweet," Big Mom said blissfully. After a few seconds, Big Mom now smiled at Jin. Satisfied, "These are by far the best candy I have ever tasted," she exclaimed in joy. "Thank you for your praise," Jinbei said while bowing slightly. "And so for our alliance, I demand a candy factory to be built for mass production." She grinned while taking another handful from the bag, and ate it, going back in bliss. Jin relaxed a bit. The candy proved to be sweet to her, which most likely meant she would want to make an alliance, but would likely need to provide massive amounts of candy. Now all he needed to know was the quantity. "How much candy do you want?" he asked, which had a Big Mom thinking with a finger on her chin. "And 10 tons a month," which had Jinbei's surprise. 10 tons? Which Big Mom nodded before changing towards a serious and calculating look. 10 tons of fishman candy. "Don't worry, we will make sure the factory would be sizable for such mass-scale production. We are willing to even provide the necessary resources for you to produce them. In addition, we are providing fair wages for the workers who would be making the candy there." Now at this, Jin, as surprise, he was just expecting her to ask for them to provide it by any means, but she took several steps further, and even was willing to provide payment and resources for the workers making the candy. "But if you ever try and betray us or not meet the monthly tribute without good reasoning," Big Mom said, daring him for the fisherman to do just that under her flag. Jin shook his head before looking at her with conviction. "We won't. We can make the candies with their conditions if we accept." Big Mom laughed in joy at this. "That's good to hear. But there would also be another condition, but right now I am still thinking about it," Big Mom said, shrugging it off. She needed some way to make sure they won't try anything funny or to effectively seal the deal. "In the meantime, tell Neptune about my demands, and contact me if he accepts it. Make sure he knows that if he doesn't accept." Big Mom trailed off menacingly. She didn't want to let this opportunity go with how sweet the candy was. She was going to have their candy either by negotiating or by force. "It will be done. Your demands are very reasonable." "You have my gratitude, Big Mom," Jin said genuinely. It sounded quite reasonable under those conditions. Big Mom simply smiled in glee. "God, if I may ask you something," Jin said. He wanted to know what she wanted to do with all of that candy. Was she going to eat all that? "What is it? What are you going to do with the candy?" Though Big Mom perked up before she smiled warmly, which startled Jin. She never displayed such an expression throughout this meeting. "I am going to eat them with my children, of course," she said joyfully. Jinbei was stunned at this. He had heard about how she was a glutton who would send her children to pillage and plunder cooking ingredients and eat candy all by herself, that she was a woman who saw her children as nothing but tools for her own gain. But right now she just simply looked like an affectionate mother who wanted to share candy with her children. "Is that so?" Jin struggled to say it out loud. "Yes. Especially my son who came back after being stolen," Big Mom said while speaking Jin's interest in THIS stolen. There was a child who was missing. A son who was stolen. At this, Big Mom frowned a bit and explained. "My 65th child and 36th son was stolen away from his crib, but we found him, and he has came back to his rightful home." This got him more interested, but before he could ask, "We are back," someone said behind him. Jin widened his eyes at the voice. "It can't be," and turned around. and his jaw dropped. There standing before him was Luffy along with two other people, a man who looked quite happy and satisfied alongside a woman who was grumbling something about how she wasn't a branch. Are we interrupting something? Broly asked looking at Jinbei and Big Mom. No, it is already ended. Luffy-kun, what are you doing here? Jin asked looking at Luffy. Surprised is he here of all places? Shouldn't he be training with Rayleigh back at Amazon Lily? Oh? Jinbei. Nice to see you again. Luffy exclaimed, waving at him while eyeing the bag lying in front of their mother. The Charlottes in the room wondered what kind of relationship Jinbei had towards Luffy. He was there with him at Marineford. What's in the bag? Luffy asked, walking forward and looking at the bag before his mother took out a bunch of candies from it and handed it out to him. Fishman candy. You should try some. Luffy perked up and took the candy from her hands and ate it. His eyes turned into Star Sweet. Big Mom laughed at that. Glad you like it, my son. Jin froze and was processing this. Oh? What's going on? Broly asked, walking forward with Monthor beside her equally curious, and standing by their little brother's side, while eyeing their mother's hand, holding what seems to be candy. It's Fishman candy. Here, try some. At this she had their interest, and they took the candy from her hand, and ate it, and similar to their mother, they were in bliss. Sweet. Witch had her laughing again. This is really good. Luffy exclaimed while both of his older siblings, and their Mother who took another handful, and ate it, were in bliss nodding in agreement. So what were the animals like there for my child? Big Mom asked looking at Monthor who was holding onto a book. They were really interesting, he said while smiling. He was glad to tag along with his brother, and witness the bizarre animals there, and write, and sketch about them. Tell me about them at the library, will you? Monthor nodded at his mother. Yes, mama. Monthor grinned looking at Luffy. I can't wait to show you the collection. Yeah? Luffy nodded, looking forward to it. Jinbei had several questions and thoughts going through his head. Were the rumors false? He had heard from people on how cruel and cold she was towards her subjects, and even towards her own children. But here she was sharing candy with her children while having a friendly conversation with her son, and then there was Luffy. At this they all looked at Jinbei, who seemed to be trying to wrap his head around what he was witnessing. What's wrong, Jinbei? Luffy asked, tilting his head towards said man alongside his mother, also questioning why he seemed shocked before realizing, and SNORTING, oh yeah, he didn't know. Jin raised his hand and pointed at Luffy. Is Big Mom's son? Luffy nodded before pointing at the giant woman sitting on her throne, who smirked in amusement at the fisherman's reaction. She's my mom. Jin looked at Big Mom, who nodded. Then he looked at the man with the skeleton suit, and the tall woman who also nodded with a look of amusement while munching on candy. He then looked at Luffy, who was staring at him innocently and curiously, and then he blinked a couple of times to process this. Ha! Jinbei X has stopped working. Oh Jinbei. Luffy shouted, trying to snap the fishman out of it. The fishman was stiff as a statue with no signs moving. He had been standing there a solid 5 minutes without any movement at all. He hadn't blinked, he hadn't twitched, he just stood there, as if he was frozen. The Charlottes looked on in amusement, wondering how long it would take for him to snap back to reality. Luffy had tried calling out to him for a while, but nothing seemed to work until Jinbei blinked. Luffy stepped back when it seemed Jinbei had come back to his senses. Jinbei, who rebooted, just looked and stared at Luffy for a couple of seconds before his eyes popped out and mouth gaped open at Luffy. He pointed at Luffy again, but was shaking. You're her son? Yay. Luffy nodded. You? Her son? Yay. Her son? Yay. Jinbei looked towards the Charlottes, who were just staring at him in amusement. His facial expression was funny as hell to look at right now. Are you serious? Jinbei asked, in which Broly nodded while crossing her arms. Yay. Unless that bastard dragon got together with another woman to have a child 17 years ago, especially on Children's Day, then no. Big Mom looked down at Luffy and asked, your birthday is around May 5th, right? Yeah. Luffy confirmed while nodding his head. The Charlottes knew very well that their missing brother's birthday was on the 5th of May, and he would be 17 years old. There was no way the dragon had another child around that time period. And besides, he was definitely a Charlotte. His appetite proved it. Big Mom then looked at Jinbei. There's your proof. That was when my son was born and taken away from me. How did dragon and you get together? Jinbei now asked, more shocked at the prospect of those two actually married, and even more so over the fact that they must have procreated for Luffy to be born. I made a deal with the man when he washed up onto our shore heavily injured. He would give me a child, and would marry me until he was born, and in exchange for that I would treat his injuries, and he surprisingly agreed quite easily. Big Mom shrugged, but was thinking about the past, about the dragon. Of all her husbands she married and divorced, Dragon was an anomaly. Most of her husbands were rejected and told to leave without getting to hold their kids, would do so out of fear, and with sadness or protest against it, an attempt to break in to either see or steal her child while being emotional and dramatic about it. Some had asked only to see their child's face once, and they would leave, which she had granted, although she sensed their feelings of sadness. Dragon on the other hand left without issues or had any emotional reactions towards the news of getting kicked out and divorced. He seemed to have accepted the situation. Maybe his goal was to get with her, make a child, and steal said child from her. It would explain why he didn't react. He was probably planning to steal Luffy and get away. Big Mom snapped out of her thoughts and was now focusing on the present. There was no point dwelling in the past. Anyways, moving forward, Luffy, what's your relationship with Jinbei? Big Mom asked while tilting her head looking at her son in curiosity. She knew that Jinbei was sent to Impel Down, due to being the only warlord to refuse world government's orders to assist the Marines against the Whitebeard pirates, which effectively stripped his title of warlord away from him. It was a big deal on the newspaper prior to his execution date. Some time later, Luffy had stormed into the prison, and freed him along with several prisoners where he accompanied her son with the prisoners, heading for Marineford to prevent the death of Fire Fist Ace. After freeing Ace, and getting away, him along with Silver's Rayleigh with her son, went to Marineford again to convey the message for his crew, and after that not much is known about the relationship between them. I met Jinbei when I got into Impel Down trying to save Ace. He asked to be released because he wanted to save Ace, so I freed him. Luffy said cheerfully. Is that so? Big Mom asked, looking at Jinbei. Jinbei nodded yes. He has my respect for what he had done in Marineford. He said genuinely. He was impressed by how he broke into Impel Down recklessly to save Ace, and how he dealt with the three admirals. And also Jinbei said, turning towards Luffy and bowing slightly. I want to offer you my most sincere gratitude for stopping Arlong's crew in the East Blue. The Charlottes and Luffy kept silent with a solemn look while Jinbei continued on. That was you, wasn't it? Jinbei asked looking at Luffy who just nodded. Thank you. Jinbei closed his eyes. But at the same time, I must apologize. Jinbei blinked, and his eyes now had a solemn and guilty look. The one who let go of Arlong into the East Blue nearly a decade ago was me. Luffy gaped and widened his eyes a bit at that, but kept silent. The Charlottes raised an eyebrow at this, but still kept silent. This wasn't really their business. Me and my crew were going to go after him if he tried anything, but Arlong bribed the Navy around a certain island, so his actions never reached Navy HQ. Jinbei stared directly into Luffy's eyes. That island was Kokoyashi Village, or in other words Cat Burglar Nami's home. Due to this, Unakama and other people on the island had to suffer from my irresponsibility. Jinbei now looked at the ground and was about to get on his knees and apologize, but stop. Luffy shouted at Jinbei, which startled him along with the Charlottes. He now looked intrigued about what he was going to do about this piece of information. Jinbei, I'm not the one who you should be apologizing to, it's Nami. Jinbei widened his eyes a bit before nodding. Yes, I should be apologizing to her instead, but still. He was shaking his fist in frustration. Were you the one who told Arlong to invade Nami's island? Luffy asked seriously, tilting his head towards Jinbei in confusion. Jinbei widened his eyes before shouting, I did not. So why are you apologizing? Luffy asked while tilting his head. Arlong was the one who attacked the island, it wasn't you. So why are you apologizing? Luffy asked, confused, as to why Jinbei was apologizing. He did nothing wrong. If I had bothered to go see what he was up, less blood would have been shed. But I didn't, Jinbei said while gritting his teeth in frustration. He knew Arlong's hatred for humans ran deep. He should have sent someone to report about what he was doing from time to time. And because of that, innocent people had died. All that did was further prove the rumors on fishermen being evil. He hated the discrimination, and how Arlong was just proving their point by driving home the nail on what he did in East Blue. Your crewmate probably hates fishermen, doesn't she? Jinbei said with acceptance over this thought. He wouldn't be surprised if Cat Burglar had a grudge against his brethren after what they did. Jinbei just kept looking at Luffy, waiting for an answer that he knew of. Luffy softly smiled, and gave a different one he didn't see coming. Nami doesn't hate you guys, eh? Was all Jinbei could sputter out in disbelief. When we were going to Sabati, we met Hachi. He opened up a takoyaki restaurant with his friends, Kami and Papag. Nami and him were kind of tense because he was with Arlong, but they got along later. Luffy said, smiling while drooling a bit. He wanted to eat his. They were good as hell. Jinbei was a bit stunned, but also glad that Cat Burglar seems to hold no grudge against Hachi for what he did. Luffy frowned, continuing on. We went to Sabati where Kami was captured and being sold off at an auction house because she was a mermaid. Jinbei along with the Charlottes held grim, but an understanding look. They understood why. Jinbei knew how his kind were considered rare goods on the slave market, especially mermaids that are female. The Charlottes understood all too well. Tata Land was considered a slaver's dream for the fact her mama's main territory held almost all races in one place. If not for Big Mom's forces and their strength, it would have been a prime target for those bastards. Some naive and arrogant idiots have tried to take one of their citizens, and for the dumber and more unlucky ones, their siblings. Expecting a slave that would get them rich when sold, all they got was an appointment with death, the Charlottes being the receptionist and booking them for the meeting. The family took great joy and pleasure in slowly, painfully, and brutally tormenting the fools that had tried to steal their siblings, who cried for their older siblings to save them, which they swiftly did. They were sadistic and terrifying to anyone outside the family, a trait that they all shared with their mother. although they wondered if their brother Luffy had shared the same sadistic and terrifying trait along with them. Some stupid celestial guy shot Hachi when we were trying to save Kami when he exposed his arms, Luffy said scowling while Jinbei flinched. What did you do? Big Mom asked, but had a knowing look in her eyes. Tamago had stated that Luffy had punched the celestial dragon, so was this. I punched that stupid jerk in the face. Luffy said with a look that held no regrets. He looked like he wanted to punch him again, not that anyone in the world can blame him for. Everyone apart from the celestial dogs wanted to beat the shit out of him. Big Mom nodded in approval at this with a grin. Yup, must be the one Tamago talked about. Bastards always had it coming. Really? And Montdor hummed, now knowing why he punched that celestial dragon in Sabati. Jinbei on the other hand, who hadn't known he punched the celestial dragon, as expected, was shocked by the news. You punched the celestial dragon? Yay. He shot Hachi. That bastard hurt my friend. Now Jinbei was shocked for another reason. Friend? Jinbei said. Besides Namor, a fisherman who was a commander of the Whitebeard Pirates, and treated like an equal. He became friends with a fisherman. A human and a fisherman getting along. Luffy nodded while smiling cheerfully. Yeah. Hachi wanted to make up for the horrible things he did, and he was really nice. Nami also became friends with him along with Papag and Kami. Jinbei looked stunned before he shifted to a soft look. Luffy-kun. Do you think humans can get along with fishermen? Luffy just grinned at him. What are you talking about? Of course we can. If me and Nami can become friends with fishermen, then why not other people? And besides, I consider you my friend too. Jinbei was staring at him wide-eyed before smiling softly. I also regard you as my friend, thank you Luffy. Luffy just laughed, then looked at Jinbei contemplating something. Then he grinned at him when he decided what to say. Jinbei, join my crew. The fisherman looked surprised a bit, but started to look down. I can't, the Sun Pirates are led by me. And besides, with the alliance of Big Mom and the Sun Pirates, you can join, eh? Jinbei looked up at Big Mom when she said that. My son's crew is allied with mine unofficially until he unites with them. Your joining still means you are still allied with us, but you would have to find a new captain for your crew. Then Big Mom started shrugging before smirking and raising her hand to point at Jinbei. And also, for my extra condition you must accompany Luffy as his crewmate when they sail again for our alliance. Big Mom said grinning. You fine with this, right? Big Mom asked Jinbei to raise her eyebrows slightly. Jinbei widened his eyes looking between Luffy and Big Mom before bowing towards Yonko. Yes. Big Mom just laughed in joy. This just cemented the contract between them. Good. Now go tell your fellow fishermen about my propositions, and tell them I will be coming with a few of my children to see the place. Big Mom said, to which Jinbei nodded. Yes, it shall be done once I go home. Jinbei looked at Luffy and told him farewell before leaving to tell his fellow fishermen about this. I'm going to go find Broly, shrugging before taking her leave to have a conversation with her twin before lunch. Montdor, upon Jinbei leaving through the door, took out his pocket watch to tell how much time they got before lunch. We still got about an hour or so, he said, closing and putting the watch back into his pocket. We could use the time to show you the library with Montdor guiding you around, Big Mom suggested, to which Montdor smiled at. The three proceeded to make their way towards the library, while also greeting their siblings along the way. Once reaching a giant door that was taller than their mother with two soldiers made from the giant soul, Montdor approached, and with minimal effort, opened the door. Once stepping through the door, Luffy was looking around in curiosity. The library was massive with round bookshelves that stood around 4 stories tall with books, as twice as Luffy's height. The color of the room was mostly brown, except for the white pillars, along with the railings on the floor, and staircase decorated with red and pale blue lollipops on top of them. Welcome to the library. This is the place where we keep animals with my devil fruit. Along with books that caught our interest, along with the section that houses people, Montdor explained to Luffy cheerfully, although he looked quite sinister when he mentioned how he had a section that contained people. People? Luffy asked, tilting his head at him. Montdor nodded before explaining further. My devil fruit allows me to keep people in place, alive, and unable to age inside a book of pinned in it. It serves also as a prison over in another section. There are bastards who would come onto the territory to try and steal one of the citizens, or worse, our siblings. Some of them are kept in the books to suffer until the end of times, along with any other individuals that have tried to bring harm upon us. Montdor explained. He didn't really mention how they would also either torture to death, brutally execute, or feed them to his siblings' pets. Those were the lucky ones in his personal opinion. Because at least their torments end. Is that correct? Okay. Luffy said, not really bothered by it. Even though he met those kinds of people once in Sabati, he had already developed a strong dislike for slavers. They walked towards the sofa where Big Mom gestured for Luffy and Montdor to sit down, which they did, while Big Mom looked around for a book to showcase her collection of animals towards the younger son. Speaking of animals, she wondered. Remembering about Syrup Island that her son mentioned, what about Impel Down? He had broken in after all. She stopped for a second and asked while still looking for a book. No, Luffy, are there also animals in Impel Down? Luffy hummed and nodded. Big Mom perked up and turned around to look at her son, while Montdor also looked intrigued. What were they like? Montdor asked in curiosity. Impel Down was not only the most secure prison, but it was also the most secretive. The only ones who knew were the prisoners inside, wardens, and the warlords who requested entry inside the underwater prison. They were pretty weird. There was this giant chicken with an alligator head that chased me down there, and there was this big lion with the face of a guy. Luffy said. Giant chicken with an alligator head. Big Mom was intrigued by this, sounded like a rare breed to her. She was also curious about that lion he mentioned. Luffy nodded towards her. Yeah. Someone said it was a rare mutant or something like that. It's a snake that hatched from a chicken egg. It's called a basilisk. Is that so? Big Mom muttered out. She wondered if Luffy's break-in and break-out led to any of those two weird animal hybrids being let loose. Maybe she could send an escort ship near the islands that were close to that place. It was worth a shot. After a while of looking through the books on the shelves, Big Mom found a book to show towards her son. She walked back to them and placed the book down in front of her two sons. There's always an infinite universe in books. Right now this one isn't complete, but I can show you my recent catch that is my pride and joy as of now. Big Mom exclaimed happily while cracking it open to show a zebra with a horn on its head on the first page. Luffy peeked in curiosity over this. He hasn't seen something like this throughout his travels. Big Mom noticed and laughed in pride. It's quite the sight. Isn't it? She said while Luffy just seemed to be focusing at the sight of what animal he was seeing. Big Mom just kept flipping through pages while Luffy changed facial expressions when he looked at new animals. You know, we used to have people with very rare genetic mutations or born from certain races. But after consideration, I decided to release them, and gave them the offer to let them go back to their island or let them stay around here. Big Mom said offhandedly. It was about a year after her baby boy's kidnapping. She felt somewhat bad for the people in the books, so she released them, but kept the animals. It also was less of a headache to hear them screaming for help, so that was also a plus. Luffy, when you set sail, make sure to write about the animals or any person who sticks out, will you? Big Mom asked her son, to which he nodded smiling. Yeah, sure. He said cheerfully, but then he started rubbing his head sheepishly. But my writing kind of sucks. Why is that? Montdor asked, raising an eyebrow at that. I was raised by mountain bandits. Sabo helped teach me and Ace how to simple maths, writing, and stuff when we were kids. But I kind of absolutely suck at maths, Luffy said, shrugging, not looking bothered by this. He left out the part where they didn't learn much due to his supposed death when he sailed out early. What were the mountain bandits like? Big Mom asked. She knew of the fact her son was raised by bandits, but besides that, she didn't know what they were like. They were really nice. Dayton, the leader of the bandits, tried to act mean and bad, but she secretly cared and worried about Ace, Sabo, and me. He said cheerfully. Big Mom was relieved. It didn't seem like they treated him like how Garp did, at least. Montdor, who was listening silently, decided to go back towards the topic about his education. Didn't teach you anything? He asked, wondering if that man gave a shit. Luffy just shook his head. Nope. The only thing he did was train me to become a marine. If I said I wanted to be a pirate, he would hit me with his fist of love. Luffy said while also subconsciously rubbing his head, remembering the pain of his fist. He knew it was infused with hockey thanks to Shanks' lessons about it. No wonder he could hit him even though he was rubber. At this, Big Mom and Montdor frowned, with the older brother seemingly more upset over this. He had always enjoyed and took great pride in educating his siblings by teaching them the basics of navigation, writing, mathematics, and other general skills that a person should have. Both older glanced at each other. Luffy seemed to be mostly trained to become stronger, but has received little to no education. He was taught by a smart kid, but that was it. Montdor, during these 2 years, teach your younger brother about the basics from scratch, starting from tomorrow. Big Mom asked of her son, looking upset over this. She was starting to question why in the hell Dragon would leave their child with an irresponsible marine. Of course, Mama. Montdor said without hesitation, and was determined to educate him properly. After a while of going through books while their brother talked about different animals, he came across through his journey which they took interest in listening to. They headed for lunch when it was time. In the diner room, some of the siblings who were gathered inside the room were making some small talk. He kept calling me a branch even though I am not. Broly said, pouting and whining like a child towards her twin, while Broly put her hand over her mouth to hide her snort of amusement over this, while using her other to pat her back. You think he would like these? Oven asked his two brothers, showing a bunch of fried tempurs and toasted marshmallows along with French fries. Tefuki shrugged while Katakuri huffed in amusement while patting his brother's shoulder as support. They were patiently waiting while talking about what they did throughout the morning and early afternoon until their mother, along with Luffy and Montdor while carrying a bag in hand, came. Upon stepping inside, Montdor and their mother took their respective seats, although when Luffy walking towards an empty one. No, Luffy turned towards the woman who called him out. She was wearing a long dress and a golden crown on her head. I am Broly's twin, and your older sister, she said slowly, to which Luffy nodded. Broly then pointed to herself. Who am I? She asked, which caused the siblings to look at her confused at what she was trying to do. Broly ni? He responded cheerfully. Broly softly giggled at how he looked so bright and innocent. She then pointed at Montdor, causing the man to raise an eyebrow at his older sister. "Who is that man?" "Montnai," he said with the same cheerful attitude. Montdor smiled at the nickname, but still looked confused at where she was going with this until then. "Who is this person?" She then quickly pointed towards her twin sister. Broly looked surprised, but then looked at Luffy, who smiled brightly. "Branchni." At this, Broya just snorted while covering her mouth to hide her snickering, while the other siblings, finally understanding what her intentions was, were having similar reactions. Hell, even their mother seemed amused, while her 8th daughter was clearly not amused. "I am Broly," she shouted towards Luffy again, who just laughed it off, and took a vacant seat. After everyone calmed down, even though Broly was kind of sulking a bit, Big Mom put the bag she was carrying onto the table, which her children were eyeing at once she stepped in. "What's in the bag?" Smoothie asked, raising her eye at the bag. Jinbei had come to negotiate an alliance with the Sun Pirates, which will make Fishman Island our territory. Their mother explained that they were interested. "This bag contains Fishman candy." And there they leaned forward to listen towards their mother's review about it. "By far the best candy I have tasted. It topples over any other sweets I have eaten throughout my life," she said with conviction, which caused all of her children to go wide-eyed and stunned, except for the ones who also tasted it. Their mother was a sweet enthusiast. She could go very in-depth about the taste, the quality, and texture of the candy she had tasted. She's even got her own book in the library where she writes reports and personal thoughts about the candy. It was very detailed and very specific about various candies and where to find them. As someone like her says, Fishman candy was the best so far. They were either mentally or physically drooling at what heavenly taste it could offer. Big Mom reached into the bag and handed it towards her two Children and Pear Sparrow and Cobbit, sitting between her, and they passed it down until there was no more. After the bag was empty, their mother along with Luffy, Broly, and Montdor ate theirs after receiving and handing it out, and were in a state of bliss again. Cracker, looking at the state his siblings along with their mother were in, shrugged and ate his. Were these that good? As soon as his mouth closed and chewed followed by swallowing it, his eyes widened in shock. Oh fuck, they were good as hell. And he wasn't the only one. Most of the siblings were in a blissful state, as if they had eaten food blessed from the Almighty above the clouds. Even the most stoic siblings had slightly joyful or cheerful expressions once the flavors and taste hit their mouths. Except for one man, Katakuri. As soon as he ate his without removing his scarf, his eyes widened with his pupils shaking. He wasn't in a state of joy like the rest of his siblings, but in heavy denial. Impossible, something better than donuts. Throughout his entire life, from his childhood to his present self, he had always enjoyed and mostly ate donuts. Any other food consumed just couldn't compare to the deliciousness, the sweetness of DOUGHNUTS. When he is in public or with his siblings, he makes sure to consume his food at an inhumane speed, so they wouldn't get a glimpse of his mouth. 1 second his giant donut in hand would be whole, but in a blink of an eye, a fraction of it seemingly disappeared into thin air, with visible bite marks being the only proof the man had consumed it. He would only fully enjoy his guilty pleasure with his mask down when he was alone, so they couldn't see his shameful and embarrassing state when he was enjoying DOUGHNUTS. Just like any of his siblings, he too had a state of bliss and pleasure when consuming his favorite food just like their mother, but he had an image to uphold. He couldn't show the same weakness like he did before when he was an ignorant and naive child. He had to be the perfect elder brother for his siblings' sake. So he always kept a cool and composed aura around him, along with masking his mouth. If anyone saw it, his perfect brother image would falter and shatter. But right now though, the always stoic and cool elder brother was having an existential crisis and questioning several things internally, while on the outside his facial expression seemed to still be the same. When a man had believed that donuts was the pinnacle of food and practically worshipped it throughout his entire life, was met with something that could top it. Yeah, expect one hell of a reaction. Big Mom was the first to snap out of her bliss, so she could see her children's reaction, and to her delight, it seems they also could agree that Fishman candy was good as hell. It's quite the taste, isn't it? Big Mom asked, smiling at her children's state of joy and pleasure. They all looked at their mother, and nodded in confirmation that it is quite the taste. Is there any more? Effler asked with hope in her eyes. It also seemed a handful of her siblings, mostly the younger ones, also wanted more. To their disappointment, Big Mom shook her head no, all the Fishman candy that were brought here were inside this bag. But if the negotiations are successful, we will build a factory over there to produce 10 tons of Fishman candy on a monthly basis, she announced. Her children lit up and were happy over this revelation. A monthly supply of 10 tons of this was going to be great. Big Mom now leaned back and was rubbing her chin in deep thought. Now, for said negotiations. When I go to the island and speak to Neptune over this matter, who should I bring? She looked around before immediately staring at 2 of her daughters and smiled. Of course. It should have been an obvious decision. When I am going there to talk things out with Neptune, Praline, you shall accompany me for the meeting, Big Mom said towards her mermaid daughters. Prim and Praline perked up at this, and looked at each other in excitement and hope. They had always wanted to visit Fishman Island to chat and converse with other fishermen, but, with the fact they were part of the Big Mom Pirates, and were entering Whitebeard's territory, they couldn't. They could cause misunderstandings. A Yonko's crew entering another Yonko's territory is normally presumed to be a raid or hostile takeover for them, considering their mother's relationship with the man, Whitebeard himself. Yeah, they couldn't risk it. Even though Whitebeard's death effectively put an end towards his crew, meaning every island that flew his banner is now exposed and open for any attacks or claim, they still couldn't really enter. After Whitebeard's death, most of the islands under his protection had been raided and pillaged for all their worth. Fortunately, it seemed Fishman Island was left untouched, probably due to both the forces of King Neptune's personal army and the Sun Pirates. But they tried to enter, and if the fishermen had found out about who their mother was, they wouldn't be treated quite nicely. Any island under Whitebeards that weren't attacked are on high alert and tense for possible oncoming hostile forces that would come, including Fishman Island. They were lucky enough to come into contact with the Sun Pirates captain for an alliance. This was an opportunity to finally interact kindly. They both turned and bowed slightly forward towards their mother in acknowledgement. Yes, Mama. Mama Good, she laughed in delight. Everything had been falling into place, from finally finding out and bringing her son home when he turned out to be alive, and becoming quite the threat towards the Marines, to the fact she had gotten to be able to talk it out with Neptune and Jinbei for an alliance for a candy factory. She didn't had to waste her forces or resort to threats for this. With the fact that Jinbei swore to sail with her son just sealing the deal. And heck, maybe one or both of her mermaid daughters may get interested and caught feelings for a man over Ghere. It was way better to see her children find true love and getting married rather than an arranged one. Well, maybe except for Lola. The amount of rejections were getting ridiculous. Although if one of them dared to try to break one of her children's hearts, it won't be a pleasant experience for them to deal with her. After a couple of seconds of silence, Defuki lightly smacked Oven's back and pointed at the food he prepared before pointing at Luffy. Oven lit up at what Defuki was hinting at. Oh yeah, he should see what his baby brother thinks about the food he made for him. He walked up towards Luffy and stood by his side and put the plates down in front of him, while Luffy tilted his head, looking at the food placed before him. What is this? He asked, arms crossed. This is roasted marshmallows, fried tempura, and French fries, he said while pointing at the 3 plates. Try them, he said with a serious look on his face. Luffy just took the food from the plates and ate them, his eyes turned into stars. Delicious. Oven just grinned and laughed boastfully and patted his baby brother's back. Glad you like it. After Luffy ate Oven's cooked food, which the man was proud of knowing his brother very much enjoyed it, then proceeding to eat more when the chefs came in until Katakuri pinched his nose in annoyance when he saw the future. The doors bust open with a panicking lion mink. Excuse me. Enemy ship spotted approaching near, he said quickly, looking panicked. The Charlottes, instead of looking tense and ready for a fight, were groaning in unison over this. They were even more annoyed because they only recently got their brother back, and it was their lunch. Heck, even Tamago looked mildly annoyed. Luffy, hearing this, quickly grabbed several pieces of food and stuffed it down his throat, gulping it down before looking back at the lion mink in confusion. Who are you? He asked, tilting his head while Peckham's looked surprised when he saw who said that. Peckham's was tense and wary of who asked about him. You were the one at Marineford. Who defeated those 3 admirals and freed Fire Fist Ace. You are the $1 billion rookie. Straw Hat Luffy, he said, shocked over the fact a person who recently became quite the big shot was eating casually with the Charlottes, as if they were family. Tamago perked up in realization at his surprised expression. He wasn't there at the viewing, and it seemed nobody told him about the fact Big Mom had found her son. Big Mom, noticing Luffy's curiosity, decided to explain. Luffy, this is Peckham's. He works under me, and he along with some of his brethren are under my protection, his mink, she said. An explanation about Peckham's. Big Mom 13 years ago was searching for the remaining races to join her ISLAND. She was also hoping for a miracle that she could find her son on her search. So when she heard about the fact a group of minks, a race that would bring her a step closer to having every race, was coming to settle in, she made sure to treat her new guests quite well with a warm welcome. She housed Peckham's with his group and treated them with hospitality, with Peckham's deciding to become part of her crew, while the rest became official residences, which she accepted with joy. After 5 years of Peckham's service, he had come and informed her about the arrival of his former crewmates, the Nox Pirates. Peckham's had filled her in about his former crew when the giant woman asked him if he was a part of any, which he did. Peckham's had told her about his past when the Emperor seemed trustworthy after 5 years of service. She had even shared chocolate with him if she had any from time to time. Big Mom found it quite interesting to hear about pirates hunting for poneglyphs, and with this information, she could easily narrow down the reasons they were visiting Tatu. When they were trying to catch up and talk with Peckham's, a casual conversation over a cup of tea with fellow friends who haven't seen each other for quite some time, quite touching and nice. Or, 2, they're going to catch up with Peckham's with the addition of trying to inspect her poneglyph. Or they could do a little trolling and attempt to steal hers. She wasn't fond of the last guess of what they were going to do. So, asking Peckham's about the time they were coming, she along with Peckham's waited for their arrival. Flashback to 8 years ago, when Big Mom heard how Peckham's friends were arriving on her territory, and how they were chasing Poneglyphs for a long time. Yeah, she was definitely joining in on the conversation, and getting to know their motives behind why, especially since she owned one. Right now, she was hiding behind a building with her homies acting as citizens by talking with each other, and everyday social interactions. She was waiting for Peckham's to talk with his former crewmates, Pedro and Zippo. The actual citizens around the area were ordered by my homies to evacuate the premises for a period of time, and were given a small compensation which made them leave without any issues. There was silence until, yo, it seems they have arrived. Zippo, Pedro, it's been a while. Are you doing well, buddy? Yeah. It's nice to meet you guys again, also sorry about this, eh? And that was her cue to step in, dramatically coming out from behind the building, and looking down at the now surprised Jaguar, and Polar Bear Mink who gawked at the fact they were facing an emperor. What's the meaning of this? The Jaguar Mink shouted surprised. So you're Zippo and Pedro, let's go settle down, and have a nice conversation over tea at my castle. You don't have much of a choice on the matter though, she said, as she motioned towards the surroundings. They looked around, and were pale once they realized their position. She had ordered her children to position in several places, just in case they tried to escape or anything funny. Outside of a cafe next to their side, Pear Sparrow was sitting on a chair, enjoying a cup of tea, while looking at them carefully. While Coppet was reading a newspaper next to him, taking occasional glances to look at the minks. On the other side from the alleyway, Smoothie stood tall facing them, arms crossed with his sisters behind her leaning on the walls. Behind them in the ocean, Prim and Praline were just floating in the sea with Montdor on a ship behind them, with numerous stand laid out on a table with him sitting on a stool, ready to give orders if they tried anything. Hell, even in the skies directly above them, Zeus and Prometheus were ready to either electrocute or burn them. To summarize their situation, they were completely surrounded by all sides, and compromise. What will it be? Big Mom asked, raising an eyebrow then before leaning forward, and grinning maniacally. Life or death? Naturally, they responded with the most reasonable option. At the castle, Big Mom's office, Big Mom was sitting with Peckham's and his two friends who were on guard. Right now, she was sipping her tea, while Peckham's was eating chocolate by her side while sweating a bit under the glare of his former captain. Zippo, after a few seconds of silence, hesitantly proceeded to eat the food. After tasting it, and finding it quite delicious, he ate more. After a few seconds, Big Mom noticed how Pedro was not eating anything on the table, still seemingly on guard. Peckham's, why don't you leave Pedro with me while you talk and catch up with Zippo outside? Big Mom said, which Peckham's agreed to while dragging Zippo outside with their respective food in hand. Pedro and Big Mom were now alone to converse. After putting her cup down after taking one last sip, she let out a sigh before looking at Pedro who still was tense. I am not planning to kill you guys. Pedro's eyes widened at that statement before narrowing his eyes. How can we be sure of that? I think you know about our reputation and why we are here, don't you? Pedro asked. Peckham's probably also told her about what they were infamous for. Yeah. Pedro, captain of the Nox Pirates, a bunch of minks in search of poneglyphs, right? Big Mom said while Pedro nodded slowly. And considering the fact that I have a poneglyph, she said, trailing off, but he knew what she was gonna say next. You're here to steal it or at least get some copy of the writings, she finished off, now leaning forward with her arms on her chin. She was curious on the reasoning, and proceeded with her next lines. Why are you so hellbent on finding them? She asked a $1,000,000 question. Was he trying to take after Roger? At this, Pedro leaned back in his chair, contemplating if he should tell. After a while, he decided he could tell her. Peckham seems to trust her, and she hadn't tried to bring any form of harm towards him. I am waiting, and preparing. Big Mom raised her eyebrow at that. For what? For the next person to follow in Roger's footsteps. She now widened her eyes at the reasoning, but instead of bursting into anger at that, she laughed in amusement. Mama, is that so? She said while laughing before calming down, and looking at him. You're trying to get your hands on the poneglyphs, so you could give it to a person who would one day show the potential for such a feat. Pedro nodded at that. Yeah. You should probably stop your search, and go back to being one of the guardians of Zoo. At this, Pedro flinches in surprise. How much did Peckhams tell Big Mom about him for her to even know his former role back in his homeland? And why should I? Because there will be a coming of a new dawn. Pedro widened his eyes at that. It may take a decade or so for that to happen. Hell, maybe it would take a century. But it will come. No matter how much the Marines, the government, and the Celestial Dragons try, someone will find his treasure, and then, the next Pirate King will emerge. Big Mom finished off, looking directly at his widened eyes that turned soft. Is that so? How are you sure? Consider it a gut feeling, she said, shrugging, but inside she knew. It doesn't matter how much the government tries to prevent it, it will come, and the world will bend towards his will. After a couple of seconds of Pedro being mute, he sighed before looking up at the Emperor. Can I visit, and talk with Peckhams anytime? Big Mom nodded while smiling. Of course. His former crewmate after ALL Pedro stood up, and bowed slightly. You have my sincerest gratitude, Big Mom. But if I may ask, don't you also want to be king of the pirates? Pedro asked, and to his surprise, she shook her head. No, after something happened, it made me realize I never wanted to take after Roger, but rather take care of my family, she said with a soft look in her eyes. So Pedro replied back. After that Pedro and Big Mom had small talks, mainly about what Nox meant, before Zippo and Pedro left to go to zoo. Pedro and Zippo had hugged Peckham's and gave him their contacts so they could talk anytime. Peckham's was grateful for Big Mom not stealing an ounce of their soul when he begged her not to before they arrived, and handling it peacefully. Flashback along with explanation and now back towards Peckham's, who's scared shitless over Luffy. Peckham's, do you know about how Big Mom had a son that was kidnapped? Bone Tamago asked towards Peckham's, who nodded. Yeah. Why are you bringing that up? We have a bigger problem over there, he said, pointing at Luffy while the Charlottes were starting to get amused. It was quite hilarious seeing the surprised faces of people when they found out who Luffy was to them. The son has been found, swore Tamago announced while Peckham's was surprised at this news. Really? Where is he? Why do you think he is here? Tamago said, pointing at Luffy. Peckham's looked at Luffy, then Tamago, then looked at Luffy, then looked at Tamago, then looked at Luffy, then looked at Tamago, then looked at Luffy, until he finally connected the dots. Peckham's was gaping while pointing at Luffy, shaking his body a lot. You're Big Mom's son. Yeah, Luffy said, as if it was obvious. Peckham's looked at Tamago, who nodded at him, and took his cup of tea on top of his head for a sip, then looked at the Charlottes, who nodded at him with looks of amusement. He fell backwards, and was unconscious from the situation. Guess it was too much for him to handle, Bone Tamago commented with amusement. The Charlottes cracked up a bit at Tamago's comment. But, as amusing as it was, they needed him to get the fuck up to identify who the hell is attacking them this time. Seriously, the audacity for these people to attack during their lunchtime. Mel eyes. Big Mom simply asked without telling her specifically what to do, but her daughter knew what her task was. Of course, Mama, Mel eyes said, smiling brightly with a gentle and soft voice, getting out of her chair and walking with grace until she was in front of Peckham's body. Tamago started backing up, gulping, and sweating while covering his ears. Katakuri, upon hearing their mother ask for his little sister's assistance, immediately prepared mochi balls for himself, his siblings, and Mama to cover their ears. Smoothie saw how Luffy was tilting his head on why he was being handed mochi balls, and wasn't putting them in his ears, so she motioned him to use the mochi balls to cover his ears. Thankfully, he did, even though he was confused as to why everyone was doing it. The Charlottes all were nervous. Even if the mochi ears blocked their hearing, they still were using their hands to make sure her voice would be muffled. Melise, after a couple seconds of standing in front of Peckham's, slowly knelt down to inspect his face, scowled, slapped the shit out of Peckham's face, proceeded to pull his ear until it was next to mouth, and woke him up. Oi, what the hell do you think you are doing, you fucking small-eyed furball bitch? Deep inhale, and another hard-ass slap towards the mink's face. Wake the fuck up, you cock-sucking sack of shit. Peckham's woke up screaming, as if he went through a near-death experience. After waking up and coming face to face with Mel Eyes, who immediately changed her facial expression to her bright and cheerful one before he could see her previous expression. Good afternoon, PKOMS, had a nice nap? She asked politely with a soft smile while her family took off their mochi ear mufflers and sweat dropped at her attitude change. Luffy just stared at Mel Eyes while gaping. She was more terrifying than an angry Nami. He didn't really clearly hear what she said through the mochi balls, but he knew that she was angry at that lion guy, and damn was she loud. The lion mink, unaware of the events that unfolded during his unconscious state, just nodded obliviously. Yeah, I had a weird dream though, Peckham said while sounding confused himself over the strange dream. Oh, do tell. Smithy asked from her seat, gesturing to him to share what dream he had, while she took a sip of juice from her glass. I dreamt that Straw Hat Luffy, the recent rookie whose bounty skyrocketed to 1 billion, the brother of Ace who defeated 3 admirals, was secretly Mama's son, and he was eating with you guys. Ain't that crazy? Peckham's exclaimed, looking surprised over the bizarre dream. The siblings were snorting or snickering quietly over this. Smithy snorted in amusement while taking another sip. Is that so? Peckham's nodded rapidly towards her before looking at all the Charlottes. Yeah. There's no way in hell that he is. Then his eyes finally landed on Luffy. Charlotte, upon seeing Luffy, and staring for a couple of seconds, took off his glasses, and took out a tissue out of seemingly nowhere to wipe it. Maybe they were extremely blurry. Upon putting them on after being thorough wiping it, he was still there. He slowly turned his head towards Tamago with a deadpan look. He really is a Charlotte, isn't he? Yes, he is Bon, Tamago said while patting his shoulder in amusement over his partner's reaction. With this information dump I wanted to ask several questions. But he still had to finish giving the description and identity of the attackers. So he decided to just leave the pile of mess towards his poor future self. Now wasn't the time to think about that. Anyway, continuing on about the attackers, Peckham's continued going back to the urgent situation, as if that revelation had fallen to a deaf person, much to everyone's amusement for a few seconds before looking serious. What is it this time? Slavers. Some small fry crime organizations. Mercenaries. Ifuki asked, grumbling. Throughout this time of the month, they had gotten very frequent attacks from the groups he had mentioned. They weren't even a challenge, and weren't worth caring about, but when they keep attacking non-stop, they were now a nuisance. It's like getting rid of a fly, but another one pops up the next day. It's getting on him, his siblings, the servants, and Mama's nerves. He knew what their occupations were thanks to Mama's network of spies which informed her of anything they knew of, and also because the siblings were quite brutal when it came to interrogating them. If there were any surviving enemies to make sure they won't lie, they did not only try to bring harm to the civilians, but they dared try to also attack his siblings too, which made it all the more pleasurable to torture them. Although, strangely enough, they all had one thing in common: when they broke and spilled the information they wanted, they were all hired to bring a resident or one of their siblings towards a client that didn't care if they were dead or alive. If they were successful, they would be getting quite a high pay depending on the person's status, occupation, and race. This wasn't the first time something like this happened. There were many dumbasses that were hired to capture one of them, but they all were after them for their organs specifically. With this information, Mama contacted a person who was an expert in this. Jigra. Mama has relations with infamous underworld leaders, one example being Jigra, a person who also works in the illegal business of organs, but he wasn't the one orchestrating this. The methods Jigra used to get organs were way more concealed and tamer, rather than the way more aggressive and bolder attempts. Jigra's normal and well-known approach was to get his employees to attack and kill any unsuspecting victim, and harvest their organs while doing it with no witnesses, and if there were any, they were just extra profit to be made for them. Knowing Jigra was seemingly innocent, Mama contacted him to discuss other similar rival organizations that also made off getting rich over this sort of business, which Jigra complied happily. It was a win-win situation after all. Jigra would have less rivals, and Mama would stop these damn frequent attacks. Amongst the several organ-stealing groups they talked about, one name stood out among the rest. Peckham shook his head. Which of the siblings' interest? A new kind of group that was trying to attack them now? No. The attackers this time are an illegal organ-dealing group. At this, the Charlottes lit up. Had the ringleader of this fucking operation decided to make an appearance now? Was it them? The one Jigra talked about with Mama. What's their crew's name? Oven asked, narrowing his eyes. He hoped it was them. He never really took joy in boiling someone alive, but, for them, he could do it with a big grin on his face while he hears their screams of agony. They are inhumane harvesters. At this, the corner of their mouths twitched up in glee. It was the group that Jigra mentioned. Oh, they couldn't wait to annihilate them. All of the Charlottes apart from Luffy looked at their mother in anticipation. They really wanted her to give the orders. Big Mom, noticing the looks that her children were giving her, grinned sinisterly and raised her hand up and commanded, "Leave no survivor," as she sang sadistically. "Yes, may," her children replied in a similar tone with sinister looks. All of them stood up with either their hands on their weapons or were ready to use either or their devil fruits. They slowly approached the exit while Luffy looks around in utter confusion. What's going on? Cracker stopped and looked at his brother, grinning madly. Before you came, we have been getting a lot of attacks which were more annoying rather than worrying. They all are weak as hell. But they still kept coming. They all were hired by some organ-dealing organization. That's why all of us are looking forward to ripping them to shreds. He finished explaining. He was really looking forward to putting an end to this because Angel, his triplet sister, was attacked by a guy from behind who they presumed was killed. He was now confirmed dead after that stunt he pulled. Fortunately there wasn't a scar, and it was a minor wound much to the relief of Cracker and Custard. Ooh. Alright. Let's beat them up. Luffy said, grinning brightly, not even bothering asking if he could join. He was going to join. He always liked a good fight after all, a trait that he shares with both sides of his family. Cracker grinned back in acknowledgement over this. Normally he would prefer fighting alone, but this problem has been a pain for everyone's ass, so it was reasonable for all his siblings to get retribution. And besides, he wanted to see what else his little brother could do. He wasn't the only one. The siblings also were interested in seeing their brother in action up close and personal, unlike on a screen like watching a movie. Looking at their mother for approval over this, she nodded and stood up to follow her children, which was quite rare. She also wanted to see what her son could do. They left to go and deal with the possible root cause of this problem that has plagued them for weeks. A few minutes later, Luffy, who was walking towards the harbor with his family, gawked at a massive ship that they were going to sail on to intercept the hostile forces, either because it was way more taller than Brogy and Dory combined or the fact that it had a figurehead like Sunny, but it was singing about being a ship. There was also the fact that it seemed to look like a boat-shaped cake, but considering that Luffy had been with his family for quite a while, and the architecture of the buildings outside the castle, and the rooms inside were themed with food, yeah, he was way more surprised over the fact that it fucking talks. Big Mom noticed her son's surprised Pikachu face, and just laughed in amusement. It's quite the sight, isn't she? She is the Queen Mama Chanter. She is the fourth homie that took quite the chunk of my soul to make. Big Mom explained towards her son, the other three being her Hat, Cloud, and Sun. We use this ship to normally get the monthly tribute of islands under our protection, or to conduct mass-scale raids, and TAKEOVERS. Big Mom said in nostalgia over how she and her oldest children would go and attack an island as a family bonding activity. Maybe she could use this time to do some family bonding, considering all her children were involved, except for her children under 13 who weren't trained yet. They would just spectate their other siblings, and maybe learn from it to use in the future. After everyone was on board, they set sail towards where the enemy would be coming from. The siblings had made small groups to talk amongst those that they are close with. Puer, Galuf, Opera, and Montour were talking about how they would approach the opponents. The swordsmen and swordswomen of the family made sure to sharpen their swords, most notable being Amand, Smoothie, and Raisin. Katakuri, Defuki, and Oven were casually chatting about how they were going to cave their skull in with a covered mochi fist, boil their innards, slice them to pieces with a genie. Defuki also handed Katakuri a bag of beans. The decaplets were playing a 10-way game of Uno, which of them riled up and angry towards each other. Saint Mark, arms crossed with Jocund on her horse, were just looking onwards to the horizon like most of the siblings, waiting to see a silhouette of a ship. Cracker was throwing a bunch of breadcrumbs towards her mermaid sisters, as if he were feeding fish, much to their bemusement. He got splashed with a shitload of seawater in return, with the sea's curse immediately affecting him. Big Mom was at the front with arms crossed with a big grin on her face, looking forward to bond with her family. While they were sailing off to deal with their problems, they were unaware of what has happened in Impel Down, or to be more specific, the escaped prisoners. With the world in a ruckus, especially the level 6 prisoners of Impel Down, the Marines and the governments are quite busy to say the least. A few days ago, when Marineford started repairs after the war, Sengoku was sitting in his office for one last time before he handed in his resignation, which was unknown to everyone at the time. The office was the main priority for repairs, so he could give orders and instructions over what to do. His final duties would be to assign a new fleet admiral to replace him, along with checking over the escaped prisoners. He was alone, silently praying that the level 6 prisoners were the less well-known ones, and were just starting out before they were taken down. If any came from the other side, the world could potentially shift and be thrown in disarray by their powers. The other side is a part of level 6 where they keep pirates that are deemed a threat to not only a country, but the world itself, for their powers are beyond something the admirals of this generation could handle. There were only less than 10 people placed over there, but they were on par with the Yonkos. They couldn't afford to make a new level for them, as even transferring one of them could give them a chance to escape. The best they could do was make their cells and cuffs thicker, while adding additional cuffs to restrict more movement. Him, along with his longtime friend Garp, had taken down these pirates, but they would suffer massive casualties and destruction in the process. Hell, they had to call a buster for one of them in order to even subdue him. Ranu opened the door, which had broken the silence. Fleet Admiral Sengoku. The list of prisoners you have requested, he stated before laying it upon his desk. He looked like he had faced death itself, he was that pale. Sengoku was wary and tense over his subordinate's expression, which was not a good sign of whatever is written in this report of escapees. Looking at the report, he paled and grimaced immediately upon seeing the top 2 names. Douglas Bullet, the Demon Air level 6, the other side. Occupations: former Galsfor soldier, former Roger Pirates. Shaiki the Golden Lion, the Flying Pirate level 6, the other side. Occupations: former captain of the Golden Lion Pirates, former Redacted Pirates. He noticed how New World, along with other well-known pirates, had escaped alongside them, but compared to these two monsters, it was like comparing a normal shark to a sea king. This was the only thing Sengoku could mutter out in stunned horror. Shaiki was like his main enemy, like how Roger and Garp were. The ultimate downfall of Shaiki would be when he showed up at Marineford and demanded to see Roger, so he could personally execute him. Shaiki couldn't accept the man he had respected was going to be killed off in such a pathetic sea of all places, which had caused him to fight both him and Garp to fight it out with him, which caused half of Marineford to be destroyed, with Shaiki finally being subdued. He had been restrained down to the ground with all limbs cuffed to restrict any movement possible after his escape attempt. He was about to sever his own legs in order to escape, which led to an even stricter restraint, when a warden saw this, and was able to stop it in the nick of time. The real issue though would be Douglas Bullet, the monster that had frequently fought Roger and sailed with him, the monster that had fought Whitebeard and was close to his power, the monster that took a buster call and survived, the pirate who also had conquerors. It was the worst case scenario possible. Shaiki was quite old, but his powers still could match the current. But Douglas, he was at his peak right now. At Ueno, in Ijishima's Skull Dome, Kaido's castle. Kaido was sitting on his throne while glaring at the man before him who was giving him a shit-eating grin. He was dressed in traditional Ueno clothes which were colored orange. It matched his long gold hair. The most distinctive part was a broken steering wheel lodged into his head along with two swords strapped on his waist. Shaiki had come to do some catching up with people he knew of. It's been a while, hasn't it, cabin boy? TSK. I told you to stop calling me that, you piss-haired bastard. What did you call me? You fucking cabin boy. You heard me. Piss hair. If you want to die that badly, if you want to get your ass kicked that badly, bring it. Somewhere on an island, a certain tall man was walking on piles of bodies while collecting any weapons he sees to add to his collection for his future plans. While doing so, he noticed someone out of the corner of his eye. Turning to look at a man with glasses on with a cigar in his mouth giving him an approving grin. Narrowing his eyes at the stranger, he asked, "Who are you?" "Me? You can call me Wayne Festa. I'm a guy that loves to hold festivals," he replied, while his grin seemingly got a bit wider. Bullet just scowled at the guy without bothering to face him. No point in dealing with a weakling like him. "TSK, scram. I have important things to attend to." "But where's the rush now, Douglas?" Bullet. Douglas stilled at that while he slowly turned his head towards the man now with a killer glare. "Are you looking to die today?" "Oh? No. I am here to make you an offer." Douglas didn't look interested in it, but he decided to appeal towards the offer out of curiosity. "What is it?" The man, upon hearing that, pulled out a map out of seemingly nowhere, showing the map of the New World with several crosses marked on several islands. "You see, I am looking towards starting a festival where I am sure everyone would be interested in a festival that would be grander than Roger's execution," he said while saying Roger's name with venom. He stole his spotlight after all. "And how are you planning to do that?" Douglas raised his eyebrows towards the very ambitious man. It had something to do with the map he was holding, but what were the coordinates for? "You see, on this map holds a treasure on one of these marked out crosses. A treasure which gather people wanting to obtain it. Even the strongest and wealthiest of people would want it. They would risk their lives on it even." At this Douglas now was intrigued. All of the strongest people gathered in one place. He could prove he was the strongest in the world if he beat them all. "What is this treasure you speak so greatly about?" He now wanted to acquire. What was this so-called treasure worth dying over for? "Oh? I am sure you are quite familiar with it. After all, it might as well be the same as having your dear old captain's greatest treasure in your hands. You had my interest. Now you had my attention." Luffy was leaning on a railing while looking in particular towards the sea in boredom. Sure, it hasn't been that long since they were out in the sea, but he was getting bored real quick. "I wonder how they are doing." Luffy muttered out his thoughts to nobody. He hoped his crew weren't in any real danger, and they had received his message. Being the first to be sent away by Kuma meant he had no idea what condition his nakamas were in right now. He decided to shift back towards feeling bored while sailing towards the organ harvesting group. After a couple of seconds of nothing he realized something. "It's been a while since I sung." And it was true, he never really sang much when he was sailing with him. He was pretty sure they never heard his singing voice. Hell, not even Sabo and Ace has heard it. The only people who knew he could sing were Shanks with his crew, the people who were there around that time his friend Singed, and said childhood friend. They had been surprised and flabbergasted when he had signed while his childhood friend just looked on in awe and excitement, something about being able to do a duet and singing together with her. After a couple of seconds of thinking what to sing on board, he opened his mouth. The king and his man stole the queen from her bed. The Charlottes, hearing the first lines, looked at each other to confirm they heard that. They didn't know who it was, but damn, he sounded like a professional. Big Mom, who also heard, was also interested. She liked music a lot, something her children also had shown interest in. So upon hearing that, she looked around wondering who was singing, and then her eyes landed on Luffy leaning on the rails, and bound her in her bones. He stopped leaning on the railing and started slowly to move up towards the bow. While all the siblings had their eyes on him, they were surprised. The seas bearers, and by the POWERS. He now stood in front of them on the bow, as if he was standing on a stage while his siblings, and MOTHER who moved so her son could be the center of attention, looked at him in awe and interest. They were his audience. "Where we will ROAM. He closed his eyes before proceeding to the next verse while lowering his voice a bit, his siblings and mother keeping silent, wanting to hear more of his amazing voice. "Yo ho, all TOGETHER, hoist the colors HIGH, heave ho, thieves, and BEGGARS. Never shall we die." Luffy finished off grinning while opening his eyes to look at his siblings who looked at him in awe from his short but impressive performance. They gave him a round of applause which had Luffy laughing a bit. "You have quite the pleasing voice," Big Mom said in delight over how her son sang with her children also sharing their approval and agreements over his performance. "What's the song called?" Hachi asked, intrigued by the lyrics. Luffy grinned brightly towards the long-necked woman. "Hoist the colors. I learned it back at Fuchsia Village." He grinned brighter, explaining further about the song. "It's supposed to be a shanty. Everyone should join in." The siblings all around, especially Mama, looked at each other before grinning. It would help kill time, and it was a nice song. That inhumane harvester's ship, the unimaginable violence. The crew were sailing slowly towards Whole Cake Island under their boss's orders. They had deceived and manipulated several groups with the promise of money to attack the territory to steal people. But in actuality, they were just used to wear the Big Mom pirates out, so they were weakened and drained to the point they were unable to protect the residents over there. It suddenly got foggy all of a sudden, but they still sailed forward. They were brandishing several weapons and tools, most notable being several butcher knives, cleavers, and hooks, along with chainsaws, and the others being common weapons. They all had several expressions of sadism, bloodlust, and cruelty, with the biggest being their captain's. He was letting his men steer the wheel while he sat by his side on a stool, inspecting his great knife, which was a gigantic half scissors with a look of anticipation. He liked it when it was dyed in red rather than a boring silver color. The right-hand man of inhumane harvesters, but the bounty of 510,430,000, or Fisher the human butcher. They started out as an unknown group before skyrocketing into infamy for their numerous counts of slaughter. Whenever Marines had came after their handiwork to inspect damages and to provide aid to any survivors, they would grimace with the light-hearted and fresh recruits either fainting or puking upon seeing their victims. They were amputated in numerous ways, with their chests ripped open displaying missing organs. The worst part was their face. Their expression of despair and agony haunted anyone who saw their corpse. After their display of carnage, they were given the name inhumane harvesters, as they killed and stole organs on a massive scale, like how a farmer would yield a massive haul of crops. After sending waves of attacks, and being told by his boss to finally go harvest, they were expecting the Big Mom Pyres to be easy prey after sending several groups to attack them, but unfortunately they were just another group of huge egotistical, arrogant idiots that were high off their power, thinking they were invincible. Sadly, they haven't truly comprehended the true power of Yonko's crew. Captain. Ship spotted. The crewmate from the crow's nest announced with a pale look painted on his face. Must be the Big Mom Pirates, he said, grinning. He stood up and walked towards the bow of the ship. Upon reaching the front, he waited till they came into view from the fog. Instead of seeing the ship, he heard a song. Yo-ho all hands. Hoist the colors high. The crew looked at each other in confusion over this before. A behemoth stood upon them. Heave-ho. Thieves and beggars. Never shall we die. They gawked at the size of the ship, which looked like a cake. But their eyes were on the figurehead. It was singing along with the people on top of the ship. Looking up, they paled upon seeing them. Big Mom with all her children were singing together in joy, completely unaware of the insects in front of them who were cowering in fear. When she and her children saw them, however, they didn't stop singing. They started grinning and sang louder. Yo-ho, all hands. Cracker had already set up his biscuit armor for a fight and was stomping on the deck to the beat of the music, while his sisters stood by his side, singing along, smiling. Katakuri was singing with a smile under his scarf over how joyful his siblings were. Oven arms were crossed with his head raised up, and singing loudly towards the sky with a big grin. Even Tafuki was smiling at all his siblings singing, as one with him joining in also. Hoist the colors high. Opera was singing arms crossed with a big grin, while his quintuplet brothers had an arm on each other's shoulders, singing loudly while stomping their feet on the ground towards the beat in unison. Baskert was singing with his mouth uncovered, grinning along with his brothers who were smiling also, more so over the fact he seemed less shy about displaying his teeth. Heave-ho. Thieves and beggars. Maikuru, Marble, and Mobile, who was standing behind his sisters along with the snake quadruples, were leaning with their arms resting on the railing singing, and smirking at the group beneath them who were pale. Pear Sparrow and Compass sang while looking at the past under them with a vicious grin. They wanted to get back at them for what they tried to do towards their younger siblings. Never shall we die. All the Charlotte sang the last part powerfully, with Big Mom and Luffy being the most prominent. She was in joy over the fact she sang with all her children, while Luffy was grinning brightly. He should do this more often with his family, and also with his crew when they reunite. It was fun. After a moment of silence after the shanty they sang, the Charlottes grinned upon seeing how they instilled fear into them by their mere appearance. A good day we are having, aren't we, gentlemen? Big Mom said teasingly and politely, but her sadistic face didn't match her tone. They just kept silent for a while, until Gore Fisher, who was initially frozen, snapped out of it, and gave orders, being as still as a statue wouldn't help. Why are you all fucking standing still? Slaughter and harvest their organs. At that the crew also snapped out of it, and let out a war cry before trying to leap onto their ship. Keyword being try. The Charlottes had immediately punched, kicked, shot, and stabbed in retaliation when they were reaching up. These guys are the ones who orchestrated this. Maikuru said in disbelief at how weak they were when she swung her sword at them with her long arms, helping to extend her range. We had several attacks like these before PROIN. They are nothing special, just another task of getting rid of TRASH, Pear Sparrow said, sticking them with candy, while his siblings killed them off. Jokund, why did you bring your horse with you? We are on a ship, you know. Galad asked, raising an eyebrow. Jokund on her horse, while also restraining their attackers with butter, while Poor shot them off. Honestly, I don't know, guess it was out of habit after being on land for so long, she replied, shrugging while stabbing the enemy with her lance, while her big brother, Saint Mark, was swinging at the people out of Jokund's reach with his battle axe, looking slightly amused by her response. Are you sure we can't join? Anana with a scalpel in her hand asked, looking at how her siblings were doing. They didn't look so tough, and seemed easy to handle for her. Pudding approached, and denied a request. No you can't, wait until you are around 13 or so, then you can join with your older siblings to fight, alright. Pudding said, kneeling forward while patting her head, and also raising a flintlock with her other hand, and shooting at her side without looking. She had put a hole between the eyes of an organ harvester, as soon as he popped up. Anana pouted before nodding okay. AW, would you look at that? You are finally acting like a big sister. I Flamp teased her three-eyed sister with a big grin, which had putting flustered by her compliments. The siblings, who were conversing, had been heard by the enemy captain, who was in disbelief. Lord Fisher, who was listening in on their conversations, was twitching in irritation. They were talking, as if it was a regular day outside, and, as if they weren't being attacked. They aren't acknowledging them as a threat at all. With a war cry, he had leaped up higher than his man, and landed in front of them with a scowl on his face, while drawing his weapon out. "Who are you?" Snack asked, raising his sword at the organ harvester, who seemed way stronger than the other man who had leaped onto their ship so far. "I am the right-hand man, and the captain of my ship. Gore Fisher. The man known as the Human Butcher. Remember that name in hell when I kill you all, and reap all your organs for what it's worth." At that, Snack just looked at the man, as if he ate cereal without milk, and preferred pineapple for toppings on a pizza. "Kill all of us. You can't even kill me." Snack said, a bit surprised at how arrogant and confident he sounded. Their little conversation had drawn the attention of the siblings, especially about how he was the captain, and the right-hand man of the organization. "Ho? Right-hand man you say?" Katakuri said, appearing beside Snack with a bloody trident in his hand, and narrowed eyes at him. "What's a right-hand man?" Luffy asked, walking up towards the two after punching the organ harvesters barehanded. They were weak as hell. Snack at that turned towards Luffy while raising his sword, and resting it on his shoulders. "Right-hand man is someone who helps out their boss the most. It's similar to first mates, but they aren't the first to join the captain," he explained while shrugging, while Luffy nodded at that, learning something new. Katakuri nodded at his explanation. "We should keep that one alive for interrogation. If he is the right-hand man, he probably knows where their main base of operations are." Luffy nodded, and smiled brightly while cracking his knuckles. "Alright. I'm going to beat that guy up." Katakuri and Snack were interested to see what their brother could do, so they stepped aside, and would intervene if he struggled. "Who are you, brat?" Fisher asked, raising an eyebrow while raising his blade towards the boy who looked like a teenager. "I'm Charlotte D. Luffy, and I am gonna beat you up," Luffy said, almost using his previous name before raising his hands, ready to throw hands towards the right-hand man. A henchman who was near them heard his name, and widened his eyes in horror and confusion upon seeing his face. That was definitely Straw Hat Luffy, who was at Marineford, even though his iconic straw hat wasn't with him. His captain was away from the broadcast due to important tasks handed to him, and he hadn't been informed about the super rookie when he returned. He wanted to tell his captain the monster he was facing, but he was more focused on the fact that he was with the big vampires for some reason, and he stated he was a Charlotte instead of a monkey. But before he could mutter out any of his thoughts, he was stabbed and drained off his life from Smoothie, who was now focused on seeing what her little brother could do. In fact, most of the Charlottes were eliminated, and were focused on their fight, like they're witnessing a Colosseum fight. After a couple of seconds of staring each other down, Luffy was the first to move. "Gomu no, pistol," he cried out, launching his arm towards Fisher, who just arrogantly smirked. "That's all you got," he said, smirking, as he deflected his fist with the flat of his blade before he flashed from his position, and appeared in front of Luffy, raising his weapon above him for a huge swing attack. Iron Scourge. He struck Luffy with the intent of splitting him in two, but Luffy was able to react in time by using armament to defend himself, before he could slash his face. Luffy pushed him back, and twisted his right arm. Gomu no, rifle. He landed a solid hit on Fisher's stomach, who gritted his teeth in pain, and let go of his weapon over this, getting launched a few steps back. Getting his bearings back, he spit out blood, and smirked at him again. "Ha. Not bad, kid." But Fisher raised his hands up, which had all the Charlottes on guard when he posed, as if he was going to cast some sort of spell. He had a devil fruit, and was definitely going to use it, but what kind is it? They got their answers when several of the dead organ harvesters were now rising up, but they weren't themselves. "You need to do better," he said, looking like an absolute psychopath before explaining further. "I ate the zombie fruit. I am a zombie human. I can manipulate the dead, and command them, as I please." The Charlottes didn't really look impressed, but they shot looks of disgust at the organ harvesters who had risen from the dead. "So all we have to do is kill them again." "That's easy," Cracker said, not seeing the big deal, as he just slashed a zombie to his left without even looking at it. But he faced it with widened eyes when it didn't go down after that wound, which Fisher had noticed, and had him grinning at Cracker. "Easy, you say? Then go ahead. Try to kill something that is already dead, Gore ho 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 ho." He laughed, but it quickly died down when he noticed how they were all still calm, but didn't move. "What's wrong? You all frozen in fear or something?" he taunted, thinking that they had lost hope in winning against him, but much to his surprise and disbelief. They turned to look at him in disappointment, like an audience witnessing the curtains fall to reveal the worst show they have seen so far. "All we have to do is just make them into mincemeat." Cracker simply said, doing just that with his armor growing 2 pairs of arms, slicing and dicing through the zombie. Actually, they all weren't even struggling against the undead, they just burned them till they were nothing but ash, shot their legs and arms off so they wouldn't move, restrained them with their devil fruits, or just pushed them off into the sea. Fisher finally realized the situation he was in, and paled. He was beyond outmatched, and was good, as dead like the minions he raised up with his devil fruit. They had heavily underestimated the power and strength of Yonko and their crew. But he won't let it end like this. He's going to at least take out the brat who hid him good. He let out a war cry, and charged forward with a new goal. Take out Charlotte D. Luffy. But sadly, he didn't know that he was like a deer running straight towards the jaws of a lion. The last thing he saw for a split second was a stretched blackened right leg high up reaching the clouds, and descending down at very high speeds. Then Gomu Gomu no Axe was the last thing he heard before going unconscious. Idiot. The Charlottes who witnessed the events thought. Luffy started stretching his leg into the sky with armament, winding up his attack when Gore Fisher stood perfectly still with a face that showed he had realized he fucked up big. After he seemed to snap out of it, the captain charged recklessly right into their brother's attack, with his foot hitting directly on his back, which looked quite devastating. It left the reinforced deck broken upon impact, said impact being targeted directly on his back. He may have just broken his spine if he was able to break the deck with a steel layer underneath the wooden deck. An interesting technique, Katakuri thought. He had copied several moves from his opponents and siblings when it seemed interesting or something that he could mimic with his devil fruit. Luffy's axe technique was a big wind-up by stretching his leg into the air, which left him exposed, but he would rapidly slam his feet down into the opponent, which caused devastating damage after. It gave Katakuri several ideas on what moves he could develop from witnessing his baby brother's technique. Even after he's knocked out they are still up and walking around aimlessly, Smithy commented, as she sheathed her sword back when the zombies stopped attacking. After Fisher was knocked out, his men who turned into zombies stopped attacking them, and were just either standing there or walking around with no sense of direction. The siblings poked them, but they didn't respond or react in any way, much to their interest and curiosity, and some kept poking them for fun. Montour was taking down notes and descriptions about the zombies, and was studying them with great interest, another entry to add in his journal of discoveries. Round up the zombies so we could either add them to the library or study them. Their mother ordered with a big grin on her face. She was interested, and very happy about how she has another creature to add towards the collection. Even after years off collecting creatures, there still was more. The ocean was a vast place, full of new things to discover. Just a whale inland likes it. Yes, mama. Her children replied back while taking them towards the holding cell down in the ship. The zombies were easily guided through the ship and into the cell. And also, let's have a very thorough conversation with this man, along with anyone still alive. Big Mom grinned wickedly at Gore Fisher's unconscious body. Yes, her children replied back with a similar sinister grin. The Charlottes started rounding up the survivors for conservation purposes, while Luffy just walked around and looked at all the people who were dead, until he spotted a familiar face from his childhood. Luffy was shocked by who he was, and the fact that his chest was slowly rising and lowering. He was still alive. He muttered out one thing still in a state of shock. Porkamy. The siblings around him looked at their brother a bit surprised. He knew one of them. You know this man? Katakuri asked, walking up to his side looking down at the man with an open red vest with a tattoo on his left bicep, and the 2 bullet wounds that were near his chest, that were aimed at his heart. By now the Charlottes who were tasked with locking up the zombies, had come up, and moved towards Luffy and Katakuri, who were observing one of the organ harvesters. Yay. He's the guy who was with Blue Jam, and beat me with the knives on his gloves back in Fuchsia when I was a kid. He spoke casually while pointing towards said man. The siblings around him froze before looking down at the man who was revealed to be Luffy's past torturer. Big Mom, who heard what her son had said, was leaking a bit of her conquerors at the piece of shit, who was starting to get surrounded by her children, who looked at the man in fury and anger. Why was someone like him running with a gang of organ harvesters? In the New World too, of all places. Well then, it seems we got lucky, Cracker said, as he got out of his biscuit armor, and started walking up towards Porkamy, squatting down, and grabbing his hair to bring it closer to his face to inspect him. They couldn't see his facial expression, but they felt his bloodlust. How so? Angel asked, arms crossed with a scowl on her face, at the man who tortured her little brother. When Cracker turned back to face his siblings, and his mom with a maniacal grin with murder in his eyes, and replied back, they also started to display their feelings of bloodlust, fury, and anger towards Porkamy. Big Mom looked on in approval. Because we can repay him back for what he did to her brother. Make it slow and painful. Yes, mama. Thanks for watching my video, and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic. Link is in the description. See you next time. Till then, sayonara.